First Unitarian Church of Honolulu, a liberal, progressive, vibrant congregation here in Nu'uanu, where our mission is to boldly grow. What? I have amnesia. I can't remember what our mission is. It's to boldly grow what? All right, I'm glad y'all have a better memory than I do, indeed. And there are so many ways that we do that here in this congregation, and you may find those ways in the weekly bulletin or in the e-blast that I accidentally sent out twice this week. Or you may find it in our upcoming newsletter and Facebook, tweets. We don't quite have Instagram yet, but any of those methodologies, you could find how we're boldly growing compassion, justice, and joy. But the best way is still WOM. What does WOM stand for? Word of mouth. So ask a neighbor after the service, how can I get involved with this fabulous congregation? And they'd be happy to tell you, I'm sure. And speaking of social media, before you put your smartphones on worship mode, we invite you to check in on Facebook or what's that other one, Foursquare? Or whatever your social media of choice is. Please feel free to do that now and put your phones on worship mode. And we want to bid a special welcome this morning to our guest speaker, who is the Reverend Dr. Dorothy Emerson. Can you believe it? She has lived 70 years of her life, and this is her first time in Hawaii. Reverend Dorothy has been in Unitarian Universalist ministry for 25 years. She is currently retired. However, she is also happily married to Donna Clifford in the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, back in 2004, and was the first to receive a marriage license from the county clerk, who had a puzzled look in her eyes, right? Wondering, what the heck are two women doing here, and am I doing this right?
No. She just was more nervous. They had training. They trained all of the clerks, and we were the first in our city. And for this particular clerk. And she just was more nervous than we were to be sure to get it right, because they changed it from husband and wife to number one and number two. Which was supposed to go on which line, and we assured her she was doing a great job.
Yeah. Sorry for making up stories as I go along.
But I didn't tell you the whole story, so. Good job.
All right. On to other facts about the Reverend Dorothy. She got her Master's of Divinity degree from Harvard Divinity School and a Doctor of Ministry degree from Andover Newton. And she is an author of several books, and she's working on another one right now on the crazy 1960s. So that should be salacious and fun.
And I had to retire to write it.
And so I ask you to Google her if you want to find out more information about the Reverend Dorothy Emerson. As Philip lights our chalice for us this morning, I invite us all to join in reading these words. We light this chalice with the embers of compassion. We light this chalice with the torch of justice. We light this chalice with the radiance of joy. So our story for all ages this morning is called The Paper Bag Princess. Now, how many of you all are into royalty stories? None of the kids. Yeah, the adults seem to be. Well, today we're not going to be talking about William or Kate. Rather, we'll be talking about a princess by the name of Elizabeth. Elizabeth was a beautiful princess. She lived in a castle and had many expensive princess clothes. She was going to marry a prince named Ronald. So that's the guy to her right. All right. Unfortunately, a dragon came and smashed her castle, burned all her expensive clothes from Neiman Marcus, and with his fiery breath carried off Prince Ronald. Well, Elizabeth decided to chase the dragon and get Ronald back. She looked everywhere for something to wear, but the only thing she could find that was not burned was a paper bag. So she put on the paper bag and followed the dragon. He wasn't easy to follow because he was easy to follow, I should say, because he left a trail of burnt forest and Horace's bones along the way. Elizabeth grabbed the knocker and banged on the door of the dragon's house. The dragon stuck his nose out the door and said, "Go away. I love to eat princesses, but I've already had my whole castle today. I'm a very busy dragon. Come back tomorrow." "Wait," shouted Elizabeth. "Is it true that you are the smartest and fiercest dragon in the whole wide world?" "Why, yes," said the dragon. "Is it true," said Elizabeth, "that you can burn up 10 forests with your fiery breath?" "Oh, yes," said the dragon, and he took a huge, deep breath and breathed out so much fire that he burned up 50 forests. Elizabeth said, "Dragon, is it true that you could fly around the world in just 10 seconds?" "Why, yes," said the dragon, and jumped up and flew all the way around the world in just 10 seconds. He was very tired when he got back, but Elizabeth shouted, "Fantastic! Do it again." So the dragon jumped up and flew around the whole wide world again in just 20 seconds this time. When he got back, he was so tired to talk, and he lay down and went straight to sleep. Elizabeth whispered very softly, "Hey, dragon." The dragon didn't move at all. She lifted up the dragon's ear and put her head right inside. She shouted as loud as she could, "Hey, dragon!" The dragon was so tired, he didn't even move. Elizabeth walked right over to the dragon and opened the door to the cave. There inside was Prince Ronald. He looked at her and said, "Elizabeth, you are a mess. You smell like ashes, your hair's all tangled, and you're wearing a dirty old paper bag. Come back when you're dressed like a real princess." And Elizabeth called her a masochistic, sexist pig. Oh, wait. "Ronald," said Elizabeth, "your clothes are really pretty and your hair is very neat. You look like a real prince, but you are a bum." So they didn't get married after all. And now we invite the adults to form a bridge and sing our children out to their program.
Saying number 70, Jesus says, "If you bring forth that which is within you, what you have will save you. If you do not bring forth what is within you, what you do not bring forth will destroy you." What makes a person great? What shapes the kind of person who will act boldly for justice? What enables a person to bring forth that which is within them to save themselves and the world? Mary Ann Williamson suggests this capacity is in all of us. Our deepest fear, she writes, is not that we are inadequate. Our deepest fear is that we are powerful beyond measure. We ask ourselves, who am I to be brilliant, gorgeous, talented, fabulous? Actually, who are you not to be? You are a child of God. Your playing small does not serve the world. You were born to make manifest the glory of God that is within all of us. It's not just in some of us, It's in everyone. One of the uses of history is to provide us with role models. The role models who inspire me most are people who struggled against difficult circumstances to become great. In entering their stories, I believe we can gain insight into our own challenges. We might even receive moments of grace that enable us to let our greatness emerge more powerfully. In 2010, I had the privilege of coordinating the Margaret Fuller Bicentennial and came to know this remarkable woman who influenced our times in ways we never knew. She accomplished more in her short life of only 40 years than most others do in twice that time. But what amazes me most and intrigues me about her are the questions she raises about my own life. She challenges me to consider questions like, how do we know we have something important to contribute to the world? How do we turn the difficulties that we encounter in life into opportunities for growth? How do we find the courage and the support to bring forth what is within us to create? Barry Andrews, UU minister and editor of a Skinner House book on Margaret Fuller's writings, describes her as, quote, a religious radical, avant-garde cultural critic, feminist, progressive social theorist, investigative journalist, war correspondent, and public intellectual, and to that I would add educator. Any one or two of these could have made her an important person, but she did all this, and she did it in a society where women had almost no rights, where her access to education and even to libraries was severely limited, and where she had to struggle with difficult economic circumstances at many points in her life. Now, on the plus side, she was born a Unitarian in Cambridge, Massachusetts, into an educated, although not wealthy family. Her father homeschooled her, guiding her in a strict, very strict, classical education, and her mother taught her to appreciate the beauty of nature. Her friendship circle included many of the luminaries of the day, like famous Unitarian ministers and early American thinkers and writers. Her accomplishments are impressive for anyone in the first half of the 19th century. She wrote and published 4 books and nearly 350 articles, poems, and essays. She influenced many women of her day by encouraging them to think and articulate their ideas through her famous conversations. She helped launch the Transcendentalist movement by serving as the first editor of their journal, The Dial. She articulated the need for gender equality in an article in that journal, and then later developed it into a best-selling book, Woman in the 19th Century. And this book then became the Bible of the women's suffrage movement. Then she moved to New York to become the first literary editor of a major U.S. newspaper, and later went to Europe as America's first important foreign correspondent. Her tragic death in a shipwreck off Long Island never ended her life, but not her influence. At the beginning of the 20th century, she was still considered one of the best known and read women in America. And another century later, thanks to her bicentennial, many more people are becoming aware of the relevance of her life and work. Now, I hope that my talk today will whet your interest in learning more. There is, by the way, a website that we put up in the bicentennial, www.margaretfuller.org. We thought she would like being an org. Because rather than biography, I want to focus our attention on her inner journey, how she came to know who she was and what she could contribute to the world. In so doing, perhaps you will reflect on your own journey of discovery of who you are and what your life means. When she was in her early 30s, Margaret Fuller looked back at her life and remembered something that she realized as a child. I think she was about 12 years old at the time. And she wrote about it later. She said, "I had stopped myself one day on the stairs and asked how I came to be here. How is it that I seem to be this Margaret Fuller? What does it mean? What am I to do about it?" Now, she remembered asking herself these questions during a mystical experience she had about 10 years later. It was Thanksgiving, and she had gone to church to please her father. But like some other young adults, she did not relate to the service. She was struggling with a disappointing relationship and could not accept the smiling people and benevolent God being preached in the Unitarian Church. As soon as the service was over, she ran into the fields, walking for miles in the barren, late fall New England landscape. There she had a spiritual awakening that served as a source of inspiration for the rest of her life. First, she stopped at a stream, and she describes this stream as shrunken, voiceless, choked with withered leaves. Kind of how she was feeling, I imagine. "I marveled," she wrote, "that it did not lose itself in the earth." She wrote this in a letter to a friend. So continuing on her walk, she came to a pool surrounded by thick trees. And here's where things began to change. She describes, "Suddenly, the sun shone with that transparent sweetness like the last smile of a dying lover, which it will use when it has been unkind all a cold autumn day, and even then passed into my thought, a beam from its true sun, from its native sphere, which has never since departed from me." At that point, she remembered these questions she had asked herself as a child about who she was. And she saw, quote, "how long it must be before the soul can learn to act under the limitations of time and space and human nature." And then she recognized something really important about the power of the soul. "I saw also that it must do it." She understood that the soul must learn to act in spite of it all. And that, quote, "it must make all this false true and sow new and immortal plants in the garden of God." I don't know if you remember the Indigo Girls song, "How long till my soul gets it right? Can any human being ever reach that kind of light?" Well, throughout her life, Margaret Fuller reached and kept reaching. She was spurred on this quest by visions like this one and others she had during her life, and usually these visions came at times of disappointment, conflict, and pain for her, when she could have easily given up. Over time, however, she learned that difficulties often lead to new insights and growth. For several years, when she was in her 20s, her family moved away from their exciting urban life in Cambridge out to a farm in the country. An unmarried woman, she was required to go. She hated the isolation and resented having to leave her friends, but eventually she came to appreciate all she learned in those years. As she reflected back a few years later, there in the solitude, the mind acquired more power of concentration and discerned the beauty of a stricter method. There the heart was awakened to sympathize with the ignorant and hope for the seemingly worthless. For the need was felt of realizing the only reality, the divine soul of the visible creation. I love that phrase, the divine soul of the visible creation, which cannot permit evil to be permanent or its aim of beauty to be eventually frustrated in the smallest particular. She came to consider her time of isolation on the farm as her graduate school. There she delved into the study of German writers, particularly Goethe, and there she wrote her first essays for publication. Although she had been teaching her younger siblings for a number of years, it was here in rural Massachusetts where she taught children other than her family, and for the first time, very important, was paid for her work. Teaching and writing became her dual career. At first she wrote commentary on other authors and ideas, and then after she was able to go back to the city, on the art and music she experienced in Boston. Before long, though, she turned to writing about what she experienced most directly in her life, the inferior status of women. Although alluded to in other essays and articles, she confronted the issue head-on in her groundbreaking essay in The Dial. Now, from our perspective in the early 21st century, it's very difficult for us to understand the enormity of what it meant for her to question the gender norms of the day. And it's not all that different from what's going on right now at your State House with questioning the norms about marriage. But for her, this was a mere half-century after the formation of the country. One of her biographers, Belle Chavigny, asserts, to conceive of women differently was tantamount to challenging the assumptions on which the nation was built. To say nothing of the religious institutions of not only Christianity, but even the Unitarianism of the day. Now, fortunately, what you're doing at the State House does not challenge today's Unitarian Universalism, so we have even more to go on in challenging those norms that are only in some people's day, not, however, in Massachusetts, and is it 13 other states, and Canada, and a lot of countries around the world. So there's definitely a tide turning here. But she was out there on her own in this challenge. And to do this, her biographer, Belle Chavigny, goes on and says, she had to create a way of life that was not yet possible, and a self whose nature was without local example. I think that's such an important thought. I'm going to say it again. She had to create a way of life that was not yet possible, and a nature, and a self whose nature was without local example. Does that remind you of anything? Mahatma Gandhi saying, you must be the change you wish to see in the world. Now, what amazes me is that someone like Margaret Fuller could do this 2 centuries ago. Fortunately, she was not the only woman on this journey at the time. Other women were awakening to the limitations of their prescribed roles. Margaret Fuller's deep friendships with both women and men, and her conversations with women, helped her shape her new ideas. Later, she met women in Europe who were living radically different lives from the norms she grew up with. But still, she was the one who articulated this new vision for the relationship between men and women, and by articulating that, helped the women's suffrage movement to, after a long time, achieve its ends. And we're still in that process. But she wrote, a new manifestation is at hand, declaring that there was a time coming when women and men would share equally in all aspects of life. But that's not her most radical idea, I don't think. I think her most radical idea was the way she based this rationale for equality. She based it on an understanding of male and female as fluid forms. And I think that's something we're just now coming to understand. So here's how she put it. Male and female represent two sides of the great radical dualism. But in fact, they are perpetually passing into one another. And fluid, she gave us an example, fluid hardens to solid, solid rushes to fluid. There is no wholly masculine man, no purely feminine woman. Margaret Fuller wrote that she enjoyed being a woman, but constantly felt restricted by the role of woman. When she spoke or wrote intelligently, she was complimented as having a masculine mind. Some of that same statement was made in my lifetime too, so maybe not in our kids' lifetime, hopefully. So her goal for herself and for society was to integrate the two, so that women would be free, as she put it, as a nature to grow, as an intellect to discern, as a soul to live freely and unimpeded, to unfold such powers as were given to her. In 1844, she went to a friend's country home near the Hudson River in New York to develop her dial essay into the book, Woman in the 19th Century. Now, while she was at work on that project, she learned there was a prison housing women criminals nearby. Ever on the lookout to learn more, she accepted an invitation to visit women inmates in Sing Sing prison. Now, meeting these women, most of whom had been found guilty of being prostitutes or thieves, blew her theories about proper female behavior wide open. To her surprise, she discovered much similarity in her conversations with these prisoners and with her privileged cohorts in Boston. John Madison wrote, "Fuller saw womankind as indivisible, not only in a social sense, but also in a spiritual one." She appealed to women of means to recognize their connection with all women and to establish more just relationships across class lines. Although she was concerned with women's spiritual development, she did not separate the spirit from the body or from women's physical and social conditions. As we have come to realize today, the social is spiritual and the personal is political. She once wrote, "Early on I knew that the only object of life was to grow." And she did continue to grow throughout her life. Each new circumstance and experience widened her vision and expanded her understanding of the meaning of life and the depths of her own soul. Her travels to the Great Lakes in 1843 brought her into contact with the difficulties of frontier life, and not only for the immigrants who had moved there, but also the devastating effect that westward expansion had on indigenous peoples. Originally planning to write a travel journal, her book, Summer on the Lakes, became more of a critique of life in what was then understood by those on the east coast of the mainland as the West. Increasingly, the implications of economics as formative for social values and relationships became a theme in what she was writing and observing. Her later experiences in New York City and urban areas of England, Scotland, and Europe awakened her prophetic voice in advocacy for better conditions for working and poor people. She was one of the early holistic thinkers. Just as she understood male and female as in fluid relationship, she also understood the body and the spirit as inseparable, One could not expect people, she said, to develop spiritually when their bodies were suffering from deprivation, nor could any people, that means all people, no people could develop when some were being denied the basic necessities of life. And I think that's one of the biggest challenges we have in our world today. No one can develop when some are being deprived of the basic necessities of life. Her front page columns in the New York Daily Tribune raised the consciousness of the American people of the conditions of a broad range of people, including prisoners and those living in poverty both at home and abroad. She became increasingly alarmed at inequities, especially those resulting from industrialization, and she spoke out for the rights of people who were oppressed in all circumstances. Her goal was to encourage and inspire the establishment of what she understood as true democracy, which would enable every person to develop their gifts and become contributing members of society. She increasingly sought to shift public attention from the self-reliant individual to the just society, from the reformation of self to the reform of society as a whole. Now, if any of you have studied Transcendentalism or read a lot of Transcendentalists, you might be thinking at this point that she was moving away from the self-culture promoted by other Transcendentalists, but in a sense, she was simply taking it a step further by shifting the application of the principles of transformation from self to society. In her commentary on Ralph Waldo Emerson's essay, she notes that the responsibility of the writer is to admonish, quote, admonish the community and arouse it to nobler energy. And I would say this is precisely the role of ministry and of our prophetic communities of faith. The evolution of Margaret Fuller's life and work may inspire you, as it does me, to examine your own life. How is it with your soul? Are you doing the work you were meant to do? Are you following your own path in life? Or are you stuck in someone else's notion of who you are or who you are supposed to be? Margaret Fuller had to fight long and hard to be herself, to carve her own way out in the world. It may seem that we have it easier these days. We certainly do not have the same limitations, at least in this country, due to gender restrictions. But prejudice and oppression still challenge many of us, and there is much work to do to enable girls and women around the world and here at home to live full and independent lives. Margaret Fuller believes society should be directed by, quote, the divine obligation of love and mutual aid between human beings. It is up to us to continue to work together to bring that vision into reality. And in so doing, we are continuing the legacy of Margaret Fuller as we seek to bring greater justice and equity to our lives, to our communities, and to the world. May it be so.